They call it pink gold. Potash is a vital ingredient for growing food in Canada production volume. It's now being touted as a secret weapon in this trade war with the United States.
The countdown is on. Canada and the United States are deep in trade talks, facing a hard deadline, August 1st. If no deal is reached, President Trump has vowed to impose a sweeping 35% tariff on Canadian imports. It's not just a threat, it's already been formalized in writing. Behind closed doors, Prime Minister Mark Carney is walking a tightrope. On one side, Canada's economy, still heavily tied to the U.S. market. On the other, a U.S. president who's turned tariffs into a political weapon. Carney's strategy has been quiet but deliberate. He's paused Canada's digital services tax, offered symbolic defense cooperation through the U.S. Missile Shield program, and tried to avoid any public confrontation. But now, many in Canada believe that's not enough. They say it's time to put real pressure on Trump, and one word keeps coming up: potash.
Gulf Islands Member of Parliament Elizabeth May, she's calling on Carney to continue collecting the digital sales tax. She's also pitching stopping the $4.9 billion exportation of Canadian potash, a key ingredient for fertilizer to American farmers.
Potash is a key ingredient in fertilizer. Without it, global food production would shrink dramatically. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization, over 50% of the world's food supply depends on fertilizers, and potash provides the potassium that makes them effective. Canada holds the largest reserves of potash on the planet, with most production centered in Saskatchewan. The United States, by contrast, produced only around 400,000 metric tons of potash in 2023, while consuming more than 5.3 million tons. The numbers speak for themselves. The U.S. depends on Canadian potash, and that makes it different from other traded goods. Cars, aluminum, even semiconductors can be sourced elsewhere. But with Russia and Belarus, the two other major global suppliers, facing sanctions or instability, Canada is essentially the only reliable source left. Any disruption could push fertilizer prices up, and with it, the cost of food across North America. That's why some Canadian leaders are calling for action. They want the federal government to put potash on the negotiating table, not just as a commodity, but as a bargaining chip. One proposal includes halting the $4.9 billion in potash exports to the U.S. entirely. Another suggests creating a national strategic reserve supported by public investment through bonds, an idea costed by Canada's Parliamentary Budget Office during the 2025 federal election. Their logic is simple. If Trump is using pain as leverage, Canada should do the same. And if that pain touches U.S. farmers, one of Trump's most loyal constituencies, it may force a recalibration in Washington.
But the simple logic is, if the price of the fertilizer goes up that much,
food prices go up.
Everything goes up, and it's food.
There's a risk in weaponizing potash. It's not just another industrial input. It's tied directly to food supply, inflation, and food security. Disrupting potash shipments could hurt not only U.S. farmers but ripple through the global economy. Industry leaders in Saskatchewan warn that tariffs and trade barriers on potash are different. Unlike cars or steel, potash is not optional. It's essential. That's why some argue Canada doesn't need to issue threats. The numbers alone, the dependency, the market imbalance, are powerful enough. The mere possibility of disruption may be all the leverage Canada needs. Trump thrives on confrontation. He pushes hard, expecting others to blink. But this time, he may have met a different kind of resistance. Not loud, not angry, but strategic. Potash isn't just Canada's economic strength. It's America's agricultural lifeline. Whether Canada uses it openly or quietly, it may be the one card strong enough to bring Trump back to the table. Not with bluster, but with a deal.
You know, I grew up in Canada, where the entire trade mechanism is built toward trading with the United States. Canada's actively seeking to diversify its own trade relations. It's currently trying to finalize a free trade deal with a bloc of South Asian countries.
When President Trump talks trade, he talks about strength, about using tariffs to bring countries to the table. But as the summer of 2025 unfolds, something unusual is happening. The table is getting emptier. Yes, the talks are technically still on. Canada is negotiating, The EU hasn't walked away. Mexico is sending messages. But make no mistake, behind the press briefings and formal letters, America's closest allies are pulling back. And in the process, Trump's tariff strategy is not just straining relationships abroad. It's also hitting the U.S. economy at home. Hard.
This is America's biggest trading partner. Other countries are doing similar things. They're trying to figure out how to be less reliant on a trading partner that is unreliable and unpredictable.
After months of stalled dialogue, Trump's new round of tariff letters landed with a thud. 35% duties on Canadian goods, 30% on EU and Mexican exports, and 50% on copper, pharmaceuticals, and other sensitive items. The backlash was strategic. Canada accelerated deals with South Asia. The EU delayed its countermeasures but drafted a massive $72 billion retaliation list. Mexico continued talks but with reduced optimism. None of these countries slammed the door, but none are treating the US as a reliable partner anymore. Instead, they're working on long-term alternatives, and America is no longer in the center of their plans.
Past 3 months, this is when the tariffs went into place and companies either decided to absorb some of that, get inventory ahead of that deadline, or start to pass some of that on to the consumers.
While allies quietly pulled back, the real pain began showing up inside the U.S. economy. The 50% tariff on copper raised immediate concerns. The U.S. imports over half of its refined copper from allies like Canada, Peru, and Chile. But domestic refining capacity is limited. Tariffs only raised the cost, without improving supply. It was the same story with Brazilian coffee. With a 50% duty in place, prices spiked. But coffee isn't produced at scale in the US, except in Hawaii. Importing alternatives simply isn't feasible. American consumers bore the cost, with no gain in strategic security. Meanwhile, US companies and financial institutions began closely tracking the fallout. According to CBS News reporting, many businesses either tried to absorb the new costs, front-load inventory, or passed prices on to consumers. Attention also turned to household spending. Banks were watching whether American consumers, already stretched by inflation, were cutting back or falling behind on payments. Another area under scrutiny was investment. IPO activity and corporate mergers began to stall, driven by rising input costs and trade uncertainty. These developments raised questions not just about current earnings, but about confidence in the economy's direction. And as President Trump continued to publicly pressure the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates, especially around real estate, analysts noted that the White House was now seeking monetary relief to offset disruptions that its own trade decisions had helped create. Beyond immediate inflation and investment drag, a deeper shift is underway. The EU has signaled that its next wave of retaliation may target U.S. services, intellectual property, digital platforms, financial products. These are areas where the U.S. traditionally runs a surplus. If that surplus erodes, the U.S. loses not just income, but influence. Meanwhile, Canada is reviewing export permits for strategic minerals, including rare earths, copper, and uranium. Limiting exports to the U.S. would disrupt supply chains for EVs, AI chips, and clean tech manufacturing. According to projections from the IMF in June, a full trade breakdown with Canada and the EU could reduce U.S. GDP by up to 0.4%, with long-term investment loss in advanced sectors. What's emerging is not just a trade dispute, it's a structural split in the global economy, with the U.S. drifting to the sidelines.
Well, I think that's the key question, is what deal will be credible, will be sustainable, given the extreme uncertainty that's coming out of the Trump White House.
President Trump has argued that tough tariffs show strength. But what they've shown instead is isolation. While allies build new partnerships, the U.S. faces rising costs, anxious markets, and a weakening position in global trade. In the end, it's not just about how high the tariffs go, it's about how much trust is left when the dust settles. And right now, America's trading partners are quietly rebuilding a world that doesn't rely on Washington.
Another letter has been posted on Truth Social, the president writing to the leader of Brazil, saying that he's imposing a 50% tariff on all imports coming in from Brazil as soon as August. A Section 301 investigation into all imports coming in from Brazil.
On July 9, 2025, the White House posted another tariff letter, this time aimed squarely at Brazil. A full 50% tariff on all imports, effective August 1st. It's the highest rate announced so far in this administration's latest wave of trade pressure. This move wasn't unexpected, but it was still jarring. For Brazil, it was a direct escalation. For the rest of the world, it was a warning. Especially for nations still in negotiation, or running out of time to get there. Canada and the European Union are both in the room with Trump's team. But they're not safe. They're on the clock. The Brazil letter did more than slap a high tariff. It triggered a formal Section 301 investigation into Brazilian imports, something Trump had used in his first term to justify long-term tariffs on Chinese goods. But what made this letter stand out wasn't the economics. It was the politics. In the Post, Trump linked the decision to Brazil's handling of former President Jair Bolsonaro. He called it unfair. He called it a witch hunt. And that made the 50% tariff not just about trade, but about power. Brazil didn't get a negotiation window, it got a punishment. The kind that doesn't start with a phone call, it starts with a headline. And with that, Brazil became the latest example of how this White House is using tariffs not only to correct trade imbalances, but to send political messages.
European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said the EU was working closely with the Trump administration to reach a deal.
Well, in Ottawa, the PMO says Canada's July 21st deadline is serious, and consequences for failing to meet the deadline for Canada aren't known.
While Brazil faces tariffs outright, the European Union and Canada are deep in negotiation, each on a tight, ticking schedule. The EU is pushing hard to finalize a deal before August 1st. European Commission leaders confirmed that talks with the US are active and making progress. Trade Chief Maroš Šefčovič said a joint statement is close. But Italy's economy minister warned, it's complicated. The text may not be finished until the last minute. Canada, meanwhile, is working against a different clock. Prime Minister Mark Carney's team is negotiating under a July 21st deadline, 10 days earlier than Europe's. This special cutoff reflects how Trump's team has chosen to handle Canada separately, after Canada dropped its digital services tax on June 30th to reopen talks. Unlike the EU, Canada is keeping things quiet. No daily briefings, no policy statements, just back-channel movement. And that silence might be deliberate, because in this game, what isn't said can be just as important as what is. Still, both regions are in the same position. Negotiate fast or face tariffs soon. The threat isn't distant. It's set to arrive August 1st. The Trump administration has said over 20 nations could face tariffs in the coming weeks if they don't enter negotiations. On July 10th, the White House confirmed more tariff notices would roll out in phases, targeting sectors like semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and other strategic supply chain goods. This reflects a shift in strategy. The new tariff wave isn't just about trade balances, it's about alignment. Countries seen as moving closer to China could face heightened scrutiny. In that light, Brazil's case stands out. The 50% tariff, paired with a Section 301 investigation, came amid concern over its strengthening ties with Beijing. In response, China has warned that countries signing deals with the US that harm its interests may face retaliation. This is no longer just trade policy, it's positioning in a global contest, and the consequences will be economic. What happened with Brazil wasn't just about one country, it was about setting the tone. Trump is reshaping trade not through global frameworks, but through pressure and pacing. Some countries get letters, others get deadlines. But all of them now face a decision: move fast or pay the price. For the EU, the calendar says July 31st. For Canada, it's July 21st. For the rest, the time is shrinking, and the tariffs are already written. This isn't just a negotiation anymore, it's a countdown.